On March 8, 1968, a Soviet Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine disappeared beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean. It carried 3 nuclear warheads, and for 6 years, nobody knew where it was. The ocean doesn't keep secrets, it buries them. 3 miles below the surface, where sunlight dies and pressure can crush steel like paper, the dead lie in perfect darkness. But in 1974, the United States government decided to dig one up. It was called Project Azorian, and almost no one knew it existed. Not Congress, not the press, not even most of the CIA. The operation was so deeply classified that briefings were held in rooms without windows, and the few men who knew the full scope were forbidden from writing anything down. They spoke in code, they destroyed their notes, and when they looked each other in the eye, they understood that what they were attempting could either change the balance of the Cold War or start World War III. The submarine in question was K-129, a Soviet vessel that had been on routine patrol near Hawaii when it suddenly went silent. Moscow launched the largest search operation in naval history, scouring thousands of square miles of ocean. They found nothing. After weeks of searching, they declared the submarine lost. The crew, 98 men, were mourned, honored, and forgotten. But the Americans knew exactly where it was. U.S. Navy listening stations had detected an underwater implosion on March 8th. Acoustic arrays tracked the sound. Analysts calculated the depth, the trajectory, the probable location. And deep inside the Pentagon, a quiet realization spread. If they could reach it first, they could learn everything. Soviet missile technology, encryption systems, nuclear warhead design, communication codes. It would be the intelligence coup of the century. But there was one problem. The submarine rested 16,000 feet below the surface, far beyond the reach of any known salvage technology. Retrieving it would require building a ship that didn't exist, using equipment that hadn't been invented, under the cover of a lie so elaborate it would involve Hollywood, the news media, and one of the richest men in America. It would take 6 years to plan. It would cost over $800 million, nearly $5 billion in today's money. And if the Soviets ever found out, it could be considered an act of war. The man who conceived the operation was named John Parangosky. He worked for the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, a division that specialized in things that shouldn't be possible. Parangosky was not a soldier. He did not carry a gun. He wore cheap suits and thick glasses, and he spoke in a low, measured voice that made people lean in to hear him. But inside the agency, he was known as a man who could make the impossible merely difficult. In 1969, he was handed a black and white photograph of the ocean floor. The image had been taken by a deep-sea submersible operated by the Navy. It showed the shattered remains of K-129, lying in pieces on the seabed like a broken spine. "Can we get to it?" someone asked. Parangosky stared at the photograph for a long time. "Yes," he said. He didn't know how. Not yet. But that wasn't the point. The point was that if the Soviets had lost something this valuable, and if the Americans could take it without anyone knowing, then the entire balance of espionage would tilt. Not through violence, not through threats, but through silence. The Cold War was not fought with invasions. It was fought with information. A stolen blueprint, an intercepted transmission, a defector who knew the launch codes. Wars were prevented not because men chose peace, but because both sides knew too much about each other to risk annihilation. But there were gaps, blind spots, and K-129 was lying in one of them. Parangosky assembled a team: engineers, naval architects, deep-sea experts, men who had worked on classified nuclear projects and experimental submarines. He told them nothing at first, only that they were to design a system capable of lifting an object weighing several thousand tons from the bottom of the ocean without anyone noticing. They thought he was insane. "Nothing like that exists," one engineer said. "Then build it," Parangosky replied. Over the next 2 years they did. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. They would build a ship, a massive custom-designed vessel unlike anything ever constructed. It would be equipped with a giant claw mechanism capable of descending 3 miles to the ocean floor, gripping the submarine, and lifting it intact into a hidden compartment in the ship's hull. A moon pool, they called it. where the entire operation could take place underwater, shielded from Soviet spy satellites. But the ship couldn't look military. It had to have a reason to be there. A cover story so convincing that even if the Soviets were watching, they would see nothing suspicious. And that's where Howard Hughes came in. Hughes was a billionaire, an eccentric recluse who lived in hotel penthouses and refused to be photographed. He owned casinos, airlines, and defense contracts. He was famous, paranoid, and powerful, which made him perfect. The CIA approached Hughes with a proposal. They would build the ship under his name. It would be called the Hughes Glomar Explorer, and its official purpose would be deep-sea mining, specifically retrieving manganese nodules from the ocean floor, a real but economically dubious venture that provided the perfect excuse for a vessel equipped with heavy lift machinery. Hughes agreed. He didn't need the money, but he liked secrets. Construction began in 1971 at a shipyard in Pennsylvania. The vessel was enormous, over 600 feet long, equipped with a derrick tower taller than a 30-story building. It cost $350 million to build, more than an aircraft carrier. Workers were told they were building a mining ship. Most believed it. But inside the classified sections of the CIA, another structure was being built, the mechanical claw. It was nicknamed Clementine. Clementine was a work of engineering madness. It consisted of a massive steel framework with hydraulic arms designed to close around the submarine like fingers. The entire apparatus weighed over 2,000 tons and would be lowered on a reinforced steel pipe string, a hollow column 5 miles long, assembled in sections, each joint precisely engineered to withstand the pressure of the deep ocean. If a single joint failed, the whole thing would collapse. If the claw missed, they would have one chance to try again. Maybe. If the Soviets noticed, the mission would end before it began. The operation had to remain invisible. That meant no leaks, no press, no oversight. The CIA created a cutout company called Summa Corporation to handle the finances. Contracts were routed through shell companies. Engineers signed non-disclosure agreements with criminal penalties. Some were told they were working on a nuclear waste disposal project. Others were told nothing at all. Even within the CIA, only a handful of people knew the truth. The project was compartmentalized into cells, each knowing only their piece. If someone asked too many questions, they were transferred. If a journalist got curious, the story was killed before it reached print. In 1972, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was launched. It underwent sea trials off the coast of California, testing its systems in secret. Everything worked. The claw descended. The moon pool opened. The pipe string held. All that remained was to go to the site and hope the Soviets didn't notice. But there was a problem. The site was not in neutral waters. It was 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, in an area the Soviet Pacific Fleet regularly patrolled. If a Soviet destroyer appeared during the operation, there would be no time to hide. The ship would be caught, the claw exposed, the mission blown. And there was something else. The submarine hadn't sunk intact. When K-129 imploded, the hull fractured in multiple places. Analysts estimated that the bow section, the part containing the nuclear missiles, had broken off and might be unstable. If the claw tried to lift it, the structure could collapse. The missiles could detonate, or the entire wreck could disintegrate, scattering debris and leaving the CIA with nothing but twisted metal and an international incident. Parangoski knew the risks. He also knew there was no other option. "We go," he said. In June 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer departed Long Beach, California, and headed west into the Pacific. On board were 180 crew members, most of whom believed they were on a mining expedition. Only a small group, the CIA operatives embedded among them, knew the truth. They carried with them sealed orders, encrypted communication protocols, and one additional piece of equipment, a large steel box, welded shut, containing items to be used only if Soviet forces intercepted them. Inside that box were demolition charges. If the mission failed, the ship was to destroy itself rather than let the Soviets discover what they had tried to do. The journey took 2 weeks. The ship moved slowly, conserving fuel, avoiding shipping lanes. During the day, crew members performed routine tasks, maintaining equipment, checking systems, playing cards in the mess hall. At night, The CIA operatives met in a locked cabin and reviewed the plan in silence. They studied maps. They ran simulations. They calculated how long the lift would take, how much noise it would make, and what they would do if a Soviet surveillance plane flew overhead. There was no plan B. If something went wrong, they would abandon the site and scuttle the mission. The submarine would remain on the ocean floor. The secret would stay buried, and 6 years of work would be erased. On July 4, 1974, Independence Day, the Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived at the coordinates. The ocean was calm. The sky was empty, and 3 miles below, in the cold and dark, K-129 waited. The crew lowered Clementine. It took 14 hours for the claw to descend. The pipe string was assembled section by section, each piece carefully hoisted into place and locked with hydraulic clamps. Engineers monitored every joint, every pressure reading, every vibration. One mistake, a misalignment, a crack, a failed seal, and the entire structure would buckle under its own weight. The ship's moon pool was open to the sea, a massive rectangular gap in the hull through which the claw would return once the lift was complete. Standing at the edge of the pool, looking down into the black water, was like staring into a well with no bottom. Somewhere down there, men had died. 98 Soviet sailors, most of them young, some of them fathers, all of them believers in a cause they thought was righteous. They had been told they were defending their country. They had been told the Americans were the enemy, and when their submarine imploded, they had drowned in darkness, knowing nothing except that they had failed. Now, their grave was being robbed. One of the CIA operatives, a man named James, stood near the moon pool and watched the cable disappear into the water. He had been with the project since the beginning. He had helped design the claw. He had flown to Moscow once, undercover, just to sit in a cafe and listen to how Russians talked about the Navy. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a gravedigger. "Do you think they know?" someone asked beside him. James didn't turn. "The Soviets?" "No, the men. Down there." James was silent for a long time. "I think the dead don't care," he said. But he wasn't sure. At 19 hours, the claw reached the bottom. A camera mounted on Clementine transmitted grainy images back to the ship. The crew gathered around monitors, watching the ocean floor come into view. At first, there was only silt. Then, slowly, shapes emerged from the darkness. The submarine. It was larger than expected. The bow section lay on its side, covered in sediment, the hull torn open like a broken rib cage. The conning tower had collapsed. Debris was scattered across the seabed. Pieces of metal, equipment, unidentifiable fragments. And near the wreck, half buried in the silt, were smaller shapes. Bodies. The camera moved closer. The image flickered, and for a moment, everyone on the ship saw what the ocean had preserved. Men still in uniform, frozen in the cold, their faces obscured by sediment and time. No one spoke. The operator adjusted the camera angle. The claw began to move, its hydraulic arms extending toward the wreck. The plan was to position it directly over the center of the submarine, close the arms, and lift. If everything went perfectly, the entire bow section, missiles, warheads and all, would rise intact. But the wreck was unstable. As the claw made contact, a piece of the hull shifted. Silt billowed up, obscuring the camera. Alarms sounded in the control room. Engineers shouted readings. Pressure gauges spiked. "Hold!" someone yelled. The claw froze. For 30 seconds, no one moved. The camera feed was useless. Nothing but murky water and drifting sediment. They couldn't see if the submarine had collapsed. They couldn't see if the missiles were intact. All they could do was wait for the silt to settle and hope the structure was still there. James stood at the monitor, his hands gripping the edge of the console. He could hear his own heartbeat. He could feel the ship swaying gently on the surface, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding 3 miles below. If the wreck fell apart now, it was over. 6 years. $800 million. The greatest intelligence operation of the Cold War. Gone. The silt began to clear. The submarine was still there. "Resume," the operator said quietly. The claw closed. Lifting began at 02 RON hours. Inch by inch, the hydraulic arms contracted, gripping the wreck. The pipe string groaned under the weight. Engineers watched the tension monitors, calculating load distribution, checking for structural fatigue. The submarine, or what remained of it, weighed over 2,000 tons. Clementine was designed to lift 4,000. It should work. It had to work. At 04 hours, the wreck was 50 feet off the ocean floor. At 06 hours, it was 200 feet up. The lift was agonizingly slow. Every foot gained took minutes. The pipe string swayed in the deep ocean currents, and with every sway, the submarine shifted in the claw's grip. If it slipped, it would fall. If it fell, it would disintegrate on impact. And if that happened, the mission was finished. On the surface, the crew worked in shifts, monitoring, adjusting, praying. Some of them didn't know what they were lifting. They only knew it was heavy, fragile, and classified. Others, the ones who knew, said nothing. They watched the depth gauge climb and tried not to think about what would happen if Moscow found out. Because the Soviets were looking. Not for the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Not yet. But they were looking for something. Soviet naval intelligence had noticed an unusual amount of deep-sea activity near Hawaii in recent months. Ships that didn't belong to any known mining operation. Survey vessels with military-grade sonar. And now, a massive American ship sitting motionless in the middle of the Pacific, doing nothing. It was only a matter of time before they connected the dots. On July 17th, after 2 weeks of continuous lifting, the wreck was 1 mile below the surface. And that's when it broke. The fracture happened suddenly. One moment, the submarine was rising smoothly. The next, a support beam in the bow section gave way. The hull twisted, metal screamed, and before anyone could react, a section of the wreck, including one of the nuclear missile tubes, tore free and plummeted back into the abyss. Alarms blared. The ship lurched as the weight shifted. Engineers scrambled to stabilize the claw. The remaining section of the submarine swung wildly on the cables, threatening to tear loose entirely. "Hold it!" someone screamed. They did. Barely. When the chaos subsided, the damage was clear. They had lost approximately 2/3 of the wreck. The missile compartment, the part containing the most valuable intelligence, was gone. What remained was the aft section, the crew quarters, and possibly some communication equipment. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't what they came for. James stood in the control room, staring at the monitors. His face was pale, his hands were shaking. "Keep lifting," Parangoski's voice crackled over the secure line from Langley. "Sir, we've lost. I know what we've lost. Keep lifting." They did. On August 1st, 1974, the wreck surfaced inside the moon pool of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It was a broken, twisted thing, barely recognizable as a submarine. Barnacles clung to the hull. Seaweed hung from the shattered metal. And inside, in the dark compartments that had been sealed for 6 years, were the remains of Soviet sailors. The crew sealed the moon pool. Floodlights illuminated the wreck. CIA operatives in protective suits entered the compartment and began the grim work of cataloging everything. They found code books, encryption machines, torpedo systems, personal belongings, letters, photographs, a watch still ticking, and in the crew quarters, they found 6 bodies, preserved by the cold and pressure. The men were given a burial at sea. The CIA filmed it. They wrapped the bodies in weighted canvas, said a few words in Russian, and lowered them back into the ocean. It was a gesture of respect, or perhaps guilt. No one was sure which. The rest of the wreck was dismantled, analyzed, and catalogued. Every piece was photographed. Every system was reverse-engineered. The intelligence gathered was classified as beyond top secret and distributed only to a handful of officials. And then the ship turned around and sailed home. The mission was declared a partial success. They hadn't recovered the missiles. They hadn't retrieved the nuclear warheads. But they had proven something far more valuable, that it was possible to reach into the deepest part of the ocean, take something that didn't belong to them, and leave no trace. The Soviets suspected. They knew something had happened, but they didn't know what. And without proof, they couldn't accuse anyone. For 4 years, the operation remained secret. And then, in 1975, a journalist found out. His name was Seymour Hersh. He worked for the New York Times, and he had a reputation for finding secrets the government didn't want found. In 1969, he had exposed the My Lai massacre. In 1974, he had written about illegal CIA domestic surveillance, and in early 1975, he received a tip from a source he would never name. The CIA had stolen a Soviet submarine. Hirsch started digging. He made calls. He cross-referenced ship registrations. He found engineers who had worked on deep-sea mining equipment that didn't make sense for mining. He located budget documents that showed millions of dollars flowing into a project with no clear purpose. And slowly, piece by piece, he assembled the truth. In February 1975, he contacted the CIA and told them he was going to publish. The response was immediate. CIA Director William Colby personally flew to New York and met Hirsch in a hotel room. He didn't deny the story. He didn't threaten. He simply asked Hirsch not to publish. Not yet. He explained that there was a second mission planned. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was being prepared to return to the site and recover the rest of the wreck, including the nuclear missiles. If the story broke now, the Soviets would know. They would station ships at the site. The second mission would be impossible. You'd be giving them a gift, Colby said. Hirsch listened. He was a journalist, not a patriot, but he understood leverage. He agreed to delay publication, but only if the CIA gave him exclusive access to the story once the second mission was complete. Colby agreed. They shook hands, and for 4 months, the secret held. But in June 1975, a small left-wing magazine called the Los Angeles Free Press published an article titled CIA's Hughes Submarine Snatch. It was poorly sourced and full of inaccuracies, but it was enough. Within days, major outlets picked up the story. The Washington Post confirmed it. The Times ran Hirsch's full investigation. And suddenly, the world knew. The Soviets were furious. Moscow issued a formal statement condemning the operation as piracy and an act of imperialist aggression. Soviet diplomats demanded the return of the wreck. Soviet naval commanders began openly discussing retaliatory salvage missions targeting American wrecks. And in the Kremlin, officials quietly wondered, if the Americans could do this, what else had they done? The second mission was cancelled. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was mothballed. Clementine was disassembled and stored in a classified warehouse, and the partial wreck of K-129, the section they had recovered, was locked away in a facility so secret that even most CIA officers didn't know where it was. For decades, that's where it stayed. But the story didn't end there. Because what the CIA had really learned from Project Azorian wasn't about submarines or missiles or intelligence. It was about something far more dangerous, the limits of secrecy. They had proven that the impossible was achievable, if you were willing to lie, to spend billions, to deceive allies and enemies alike, to manipulate the press, and to operate entirely outside democratic oversight. They had shown that a government could do anything as long as no one was watching. And for a while, no one was. But the exposure of Project Azorian changed that. It became a symbol, not of American ingenuity, but of American overreach. It fueled distrust. It inspired congressional investigations. It led directly to the creation of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which for the first time imposed oversight on covert operations. The age of invisible wars was ending, not because the wars stopped, but because people had started looking. James, the CIA operative who had stood at the edge of the moon pool, retired in 1976. He never spoke publicly about the mission. He signed non-disclosure agreements that would follow him to his grave. But privately, in the years that followed, he thought about it often. He thought about the bodies they had found. The 6 Soviet sailors still in uniform, still at their posts, preserved by the cold. He thought about the burial at sea, the Russian words spoken over men whose families would never know what happened to them. He thought about the wreck, how it had broken apart in their hands, how they had almost lost it entirely, how close they had come to disaster. And he thought about the question someone had asked him on the ship, on that night in July when the Claw was descending. Do you think they know? He never answered. Because the truth was, he didn't know if the dead cared. But he knew the living did. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian government approached the United States with a quiet request. They wanted to know what had happened to K-129. They wanted to know if the Americans had recovered it. And if so, they wanted the remains of the crew returned for proper burial. The CIA confirmed the mission. They released some, but not all, of the details. They provided the footage of the burial at sea, and they returned a few personal items: a sailor's cap, a wedding ring, a photograph of a woman holding a child. The families wept, not because their sons and husbands had died, they had known that for decades, but because for the first time, they understood how. And they realized that even in death, their loved ones had been used as pawns in a game they never chose to play. John Parangoski, the man who had conceived the operation, never gave interviews. He refused to be photographed. He declined book deals and documentary requests. When journalists tracked him down, he would say only one thing: it was necessary. He believed that. Until the day he died, he believed that stealing K-129 had been the right decision. Not because it was moral, but because it was effective. In the Cold War, morality was a luxury. The Soviets were building missiles. The Americans had to know how many, how fast, how accurate. And if that meant desecrating a grave, then so be it. He never apologized. But late in his life, in a conversation with a colleague that was never meant to be recorded, he said something else. We treated it like a heist, like we were stealing gold. But it wasn't gold. It was men. And I think we forgot that. The colleague asked what he meant. Parangoski was silent for a long time. I mean, he said finally, that somewhere in Moscow, there are mothers who never got to bury their sons, and we're the reason why. He never said anything like that again. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was eventually sold to a private company and converted into a deep-sea drilling ship. It still exists today, operating under a different name, performing offshore oil exploration in the South China Sea. Most of the crew who worked on the original mission are dead now. A few remain, living quiet lives in California, Texas, Pennsylvania. They don't talk about it. Some because they signed agreements, others because they don't want to remember. The wreck of K-129, or what's left of it, remains in a classified storage facility. Occasionally, a researcher will request access. Occasionally, the request is denied. No reason given. The 6 sailors who were buried at sea have no marked grave. The coordinates were never released. The ocean keeps them, as it keeps all the lost things of the Cold War. The planes that vanished, the ships that sank, the men who were declared missing and never found. Their names are carved on a memorial in Vladivostok. Their families visit sometimes, leaving flowers that wilt in the rain. They do not know that their sons were found. They do not know that they were lifted from the deep, examined, catalogued, and returned. They do not know that somewhere in a vault in Virginia, there are photographs of their faces, frozen in death, labeled with numbers instead of names. Perhaps it's better that way. There is a phrase that emerged from Project Azorian, one that has since entered the American legal lexicon. I can neither confirm nor deny. It began as a response to Freedom of Information Act requests about the mission. Journalists would ask for documents. The CIA would reply, "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such records." It was a perfect non-answer, a way of refusing to speak without admitting guilt. It became known as the Glomar response, and it's still used today in courts, in congressional hearings, in classified briefings. It's a legal shield, a bureaucratic weapon, a way of saying we will not tell you the truth, and you cannot make us. It's a reminder that secrecy isn't just about hiding information. It's about controlling it, about deciding who gets to know and who gets to ask, and who gets to live with the consequences of not knowing. The Cold War was full of Glomar responses. Entire operations were built on them. Men died because of them. And when the war ended, the phrase remained, a ghost of a conflict that never officially existed. In 2010, the CIA declassified a partial account of Project Azorian. The document was heavily redacted. Entire pages were blacked out. Names were removed. Locations were obscured. But the basic facts were there. The mission, the ship, the claw, the wreck, the bodies. And at the end of the document, in a section labeled Lessons Learned, there was a single sentence. Operations of this scale cannot remain secret indefinitely. It was an admission, however small, that the age of invisible power was over. That no matter how deep you bury a secret, someone will dig it up. That the ocean doesn't keep graves. It only delays the reckoning. But the document didn't say what happened to the intelligence they recovered. It didn't say what the code books revealed or what the encryption machines unlocked or whether any of it actually mattered. Because in the end, that wasn't the point. The point was that they tried, that they believed it was possible to reach into the abyss, take what they wanted, and leave no trace, that they thought they could operate outside the rules, outside accountability, outside history itself. And for a while, they did. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Cold War ended not with a battle, but with a whimper, a slow unraveling of ideology, economy, and trust. The Berlin Wall fell, the Iron Curtain lifted, and in the chaos that followed, a generation of secrets spilled into the open. Files were opened, defectors spoke, veterans gave interviews, and slowly, the world began to understand what had been done in the name of security. The gulags, the purges, the surveillance, the disappearances, the lies told to children, to soldiers, to entire nations. And on the other side, the Americans had their own reckoning. MKUltra, COINTELPRO, Operation Condor, Phoenix Program, black sites and rendition flights and torture memos and wars that were never declared. Neither side was innocent. Neither side could claim the moral high ground. Both had sacrificed their people on the altar of ideology and called it necessary. And in the middle of it all, at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, lay a broken submarine, a monument to the futility of it all. There are still men in Russia who remember K-129. They are old now, in their 70s and 80s, living in cities that no longer bear the names they once knew. They gather sometimes, on the anniversary of the sinking, and drink vodka, and speak of the crew as if they were brothers. They talk about the captain, a man named Kobzar, stern and disciplined, who believed in the mission above all else. They talk about the navigator, the sonar operator, the young conscript who had joined the Navy because his father told him it was an honor. They do not talk about what the Americans did. Most of them don't know. The Russian government never told them. And when rumors circulated in the 1990s, they were dismissed as propaganda, as lies, as the bitter fantasies of a defeated nation. But some of them suspect. They suspect because the ocean doesn't give up bodies after 6 years. They suspect because the Americans were too quiet, too evasive, too careful with their words. They suspect because they know their own government did the same thing, salvaged wrecks, stole technology, buried the evidence. And they suspect because deep down they understand the truth, that in the Cold War, no one was buried with dignity. Not the soldiers, not the spies, not the civilians caught in the crossfire. Everyone was a tool, everyone was expendable, and when the game was over, the dead were left to rot. In 2017, a documentary filmmaker tried to locate the exact coordinates of K-129's resting place. He used declassified Navy sonar maps, acoustic analysis, and interviews with former crew members of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. He calculated drift patterns, ocean currents, and seabed topology. And after 2 years of research, he pinpointed a location, approximately 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii, in a region known as the Pacific Abyssal Plain. He wanted to send a submersible down. He wanted to film what remained. He wanted to see if the Americans had left anything behind. His funding request was denied. No explanation given. He tried again, this time through a private investor. The investor pulled out at the last minute, citing security concerns. He tried a third time, offering to keep the footage classified, to share it only with researchers, to avoid any publicity. The U.S. government sent him a letter. It was polite, formal, and brief. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of any materials related to your request. The Glomar response. The filmmaker gave up. The coordinates remain unpublished, and the wreck, if it's still there, remains undisturbed. James died in 2003. He had lived a quiet life after the CIA. He worked as a consultant for a defense contractor. He married, had 2 children, and retired to a small house in Virginia. He never spoke about Project Azorian, not to his wife, not to his children, not even to his therapist, though he saw one for years. But he thought about it. Every year, on July 4th, the day the Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived at the site, He would sit on his porch and stare at the sky and think about the men at the bottom of the ocean. He wondered if they had known they were going to die. He wondered if they had time to be afraid. He wondered if, in the last moments, they had thought of their families, their homes, the lives they would never live. He wondered if they hated him. Before he died, he wrote a letter. He sealed it in an envelope and left instructions that it should be opened only after his death. His children opened it in 2004. Inside was a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry we took you from the dark." His children didn't understand. They asked his former colleagues. They researched his career. They found nothing conclusive. Eventually, they put the letter in a box with his other belongings and forgot about it. But the words remained. And perhaps in some way they still echo. A quiet apology to men who will never hear it, in a language that no longer matters, for a crime that was never officially committed. The Cold War is over, but its logic remains. Nations still spy on each other. Secrets are still buried. Operations are still launched in the dark, with no oversight, no accountability, no names attached. And when something goes wrong, when a drone strike kills civilians, when a rendition ends in a black site, when a surveillance program is exposed, the response is always the same. It was necessary. We cannot confirm or deny. National security requires secrecy. The language changes. The technology evolves. But the structure remains. Power operating in shadows, justified by fear, shielded by classification. And at the bottom of the ocean, at the edges of deserts, in unmarked graves scattered across the world, the dead wait. They do not wait for justice. Justice is a concept for the living. They wait only for memory, for someone to say their name, to acknowledge that they existed, to admit that they were more than tools. But memory is fragile, and the powerful do not like to remember. Project Azorian cost over $800 million. It employed thousands of people. It required the construction of a ship, the invention of new technology, the cooperation of private industry, and the deception of the press. It spanned 6 years and involved some of the brightest minds in engineering, intelligence, and military strategy. And what did it achieve? A partial wreck, some code books, a few pieces of equipment, intelligence that was, by most accounts, outdated by the time it was analyzed. The missiles, the real prize, were never recovered. The nuclear warheads remained on the ocean floor, buried under silt, slowly corroding into the sea. Was it worth it? The CIA said yes. The engineers said yes. The politicians, when pressed, said yes. But the families of the 98 men who died on K-129 were never asked. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Project Azorian, that the value of a mission is measured not by the living, but by the dead. And the dead have no voice. There is a room in Moscow, in the headquarters of the Russian Navy, where the names of lost submarines are inscribed on a marble wall. K-129 is there. So is Kursk. So is K-141, K-8, K-219, and dozens of others. Vessels that disappeared into the cold, taking their crews with them. Families visit sometimes. They touch the names. They leave flowers. They whisper prayers. They do not know, most of them, that one of those submarines was found, that it was lifted from the deep, broken apart, and taken to a foreign land, that their sons and brothers and fathers were examined like specimens and buried in an ocean that is not their home. Perhaps it's better that way. Perhaps ignorance is kinder than truth. But there are some who know. Veterans, researchers, officials who read the declassified files and understood what had been done. And they are angry, not because the Americans stole a submarine, but because they stole dignity. Because in the end, that's what the Cold War took from everyone. The right to be mourned properly. The right to be remembered as people, not as casualties. The right to rest without being disturbed. K-129 was not the first grave robbed in the name of security, and it will not be the last. In 2020, a Russian naval officer gave an interview to a small independent newspaper. He was retired, in his 80s, and no longer afraid of speaking. He said, "We knew the Americans took it. We always knew. But what could we do? Start a war over a submarine that was already lost? Our own leadership wanted it buried. The crew had failed. The mission had failed. And in the Soviet Union, failure was erased. So we let the Americans have it. We pretended we didn't know, and they pretended it was a mining operation, and the whole world pretended that none of it mattered. But it did matter, because those were our men, and they deserved better. The interview was published in a newspaper, with a circulation of less than 10,000. It was never translated into English. It was never picked up by major outlets. It disappeared, like so many truths, into the noise of history. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile truth really is, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten, not because they are glorious, but because they are human. Because in the end, that's all we are. Humans, making choices in the dark, hoping we won't be judged too harshly when the light finally comes. But the light always comes, and when it does, the only question that matters is this: will we recognize ourselves in what it reveals? The ocean is still there, 3 miles deep, cold, dark, silent, and somewhere in that darkness, the rest of K-129 remains. The missiles, the warheads, the bodies of 92 men who were never recovered. They are beyond the reach of governments now, beyond salvage, beyond politics, beyond history. They belong only to the sea. And the sea, unlike us, does not lie. It does not justify. It does not explain. It does not say it was necessary. It simply holds what we give it, and waits for us to decide if we want it back.